Hello, I'm Catriona. I'm a sensory-motor psychotherapist. What I'd like to talk to you today about is our Vega Map. It's something that I put together to try and explain and help people understand why things are linked into each other and how they affect each other. Because often people want to know why they're affected by things that happened in the past, or are they affected by things that have happened? What impact has their childhood had on them? What impact have all our life experiences had on us? And it can be really difficult trying to pull these things apart and know if one affects the other, why one thing is connected to the other. When you look at it in different sections and as a journey that flows into each other, it can help you identify at what parts, what time of life, some of these issues that you're struggling with began to emerge, and then how that affected the next stage of your life. And hopefully it can just help you get a clearer understanding of the person you are today and make a bit of sense of the journey that you've been on so far. The first stage in our journey on our map is attachment. I talk about attachment a lot because it sets the foundation stones for how we relate to people, how safe we feel in the world, how we regulate our nervous system. It's responsible for an awful lot of those foundation stones and the way that we interact with people. It's how our needs were met when we were little. It's not about how much we were loved, it's about how our physical, emotional and physiological, practical needs were met and how that interaction played out between us and our main carers. And it sets a real blueprint for how we manage and recognise our own needs, how much value we put on them, how connected we feel to ourselves, how comfortable we feel in our own skin, how we relate to other people, and how we behave and our patterns of behaviour in relationships. Those things are all formed in attachment. The next stage in the journey is regulation, and the reason that it follows on from attachment is it is one of the most important things that we learn from our attachment and that we get from our attachment. We learn how to regulate ourselves, and the reason it's so closely linked to attachment is because it's about our needs, how our needs were met. If we take upset and fear, then the way that those expressions of fear and the body sensations that go along with it, how they were met, treated by our carer, will determine how we regulate ourselves. If we were left to cry and just to self-soothe, then that's how we will go forward in terms of our regulation. So those two things, our attachment style and the way that we learn how to be regulated or regulate ourselves, plays a huge part in how we manage our own nervous system. The relationship we have to emotions and touch and nurture, how we are in relationship, how we depend on or don't depend on our partner. To be able to regulate our nervous system is super important because it's how we manage our anxiety levels, it's how we build up our resilience, it's how we build our window of tolerance, that are all our emotions and our nervous system, how well we cope with them, how well we deal with them. The next stage in our journey is relationships, and the reason that this follows on from attachment and regulation into relationships is because it's in relationships that a lot of these things play themselves out. A lot of people will find that they have similar patterns that happen to them in relationship. They have similar reasons for breaking up. We'll find that we're attracted to a certain type of person, and that's partly because of familiarity. The thing with attachment is because it's a survival mechanism, it's not a choice. It's hardwired into our core, into our being. And those things will play themselves out on a very unconscious level in a relationship. It's where things like needs become they play themselves out. Do our needs just diminish in a relationship? Are somebody else's needs the most paramount important thing? Or do we become acutely aware of what our needs are? And those things are really important in terms of how they're met and acknowledged by our partner. And we often parent and attach to people. We can do it in quite a different way, but we parent ourselves with the same attachment style to the one that predominantly we've experienced as children. And these things play out in relationships. So from relationships, we move on in our journey and start looking at the different parts of us. What I mean by different parts is we all have internal different parts of ourselves, and they will have been formed through previous past experiences and relationships. If something really upsets us or makes us feel really left out of something, we can have a child part that comes up and doesn't behave like your adult self, but actually has a lot of childlike characteristics and, will feel really little and squashed and want to go away and hide. Or we might have older parts that can be a little bit outraged at things, and they don't all look like our adult self. They also have physical characteristics. Now, depending on how traumatizing or how difficult these experiences were at any particular age will determine how many different parts we have and how they show up at different times and how they play themselves out. This is different to dissociation and having completely separate parts of ourselves, but to a lesser or greater degree. We all have them, but we might not really be aware of what parts of us we do have, how those parts play out, why we kind of look back on certain things and go, I have no idea why I did that. When we know more about the different parts of us, it's easier then to recognise when they start coming out and playing out. It's like, oh, that's not my adult self, that's a much younger child self. The more child parts we have and the more vulnerable parts that we have and more frightened parts that we have are probably more likely to be the ones that will get traumatized, frozen in fear, which is why looking at how all these things connect is so important. So the next one that we'll be looking at is trauma. We all have the capacity to be traumatized and have PTSD. When we get overwhelmed, when too many things happen to us, if something is too frightening, too overwhelming, feels like a life-threatening experience, we're going to get traumatized. The more resilience we have, the more we're able to deal with and feel and be emotional and let these things play out, the more we can feel sensation as well as feelings, then we are going to work through the experiences that we've had, and they're less likely to get logged into the place in our brain that registers trauma. And the more that we can do that, the less likely we are to become traumatized and then triggered. And our attachment and our regulation is a huge part. It plays a massive part in how much resilience we have and how much capacity we have for dealing with difficult experiences. The more capacity we have, the less likely we're going to get overwhelmed and therefore traumatized. The thing is, when we're little, our nervous system and ourselves can be really, really overwhelmed by things that wouldn't overwhelm us or frighten us to that degree as an adult. A lot of my clients have had past experiences that they haven't registered as, well, that can't be a trauma because it wasn't that big a deal. But when we start looking at things and the way that things have affected us, it can become quite apparent that in those young, very vulnerable states, yes, we have become quite traumatized by things that definitely wouldn't affect us now. And when we start exploring this journey and our map, then it can start to make an awful lot more sense of why we do the things that we do, why we're triggered, why we avoid things, just the way that things play out for us. The next stage in our journey is patterns and behaviours. As we've gone through all the different stages, we can see how one thing leads into another, and is affected and impacted on what's gone before. The culmination of a lot of these things mean that we have to have some coping mechanisms. We develop coping mechanisms to help us manage things that are difficult as a way of being able to function. We can make sense of our coping mechanisms by looking at the journey that we've had. Why have they been important? Why were they necessary? Why are they useful? What purpose could they have served? They're not things that we turn off and turn on. They tend to be a part of us. They tend to be a kind of unconscious thing that we'll keep doing. When coping mechanisms can become difficult is when they start to take on a life of their own. Sometimes we find a resource is really useful, makes us feel better in the moment. However, if we become completely dependent upon that resource, then it's no longer of benefit to us. It's something that we can't do without and we fear losing or not being there. And it's how we develop addictions, it's how we develop coping mechanisms that aren't so helpful and useful. When we've had traumatic experiences, if we keep getting triggered by things, then we're going to need coping mechanisms to help us deal with what's coming up for us. And those things can become very embedded in our whole self, and we can become very dependent on them. We need them. They're useful, but sometimes they're not the healthiest or the best that they could be. When we can have more understanding about them, then it gives us an opportunity to actually either do some healing so we don't need those coping mechanisms so much, or find a way of meeting that need in a healthier way. The last part in our journey is healing, thank goodness. At the end of all this journey and all these ups and downs and bumps in the road that we hit, there's always healing at the end. And the more we know about what points in our life we've hit a bump, things have happened to us, how we can recognise how these things have affected us and the imprint it's left in us, that gives us a much clearer idea of what healing is needed. Because, I mean, just look at the complexity of this journey. Everybody's journey is different. Everybody's experiences are different. We all have the same brain and we all have the same nervous system, but how it gets impacted by this long, convoluted journey, this complicated thing that is life, means that we all have different wounds and different needs within those wounds of what is needed in order to heal, to grow, to develop, to be able to put some of these things further back in the past, to let them fade, to deal with them so that they don't just keep coming up. We're not carrying them around with us all the time. When we can have healing, then we can have new experiences. We don't have to keep repeating the same patterns of behaviour. We don't have to keep having the same destructive or toxic relationships. We don't have to keep having the same battles with ourselves. But when we know what's needed, and when we can work through that from the body, when we can let the body tell us where these wounds are, how they show up, what's needed, when we can work with the body, listen to the body, then we can have some real deep understanding of what that healing would look like, what it feels like, how it transforms, how we can now regulate ourselves, how we can process our trauma, how we can have boundaries, how we can be present and fully comfortable in our own skin. All of these things, they can be healed, can be helped, and we can have growth, development, change once we understand, and once we can have some acceptance and hopefully a bit of compassion about what we've been through. The next stage of our journey after healing is going to look a whole lot more functional, happier, connected, settled. Healing carries on through our years, just as the same way that our attachments grow and develop. It's not a static, linear thing, and the Vega Map, hopefully, will help you understand and identify the journey that you've been on through your life. I really hope this has been helpful. If you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a big thumbs up and like and subscribe below. Thank you, see you next time. Bye.